Good morning, everyone. So today you and I are going to talk about server-side rendering and basically a question that I got from a subscriber. So let's get into it. So I was fortunate enough to have a subscriber that was watching one of my videos about where I virtually compare a single page application to server-side rendering and the pros and the cons with these two approaches. And so the question became, Frederick, which language would you recommend to do server-side rendering? And that's an excellent question, so I thought I'll touch on that. So if you're asking that question, I will assume one thing, that you are most likely fairly fresh in your career and that you may not have a little bit of the history of programming with you. Because if or rather from my perspective, if you're asking that question, which it's a great question, don't make any mistake about it. But I would argue, and now I'm sticking my neck out a little bit here, but I would argue that for a programmer who's been around the block for a little while, that question has a fairly strong candidate. And I will argue that the best language out there, if you're all things considered, if you're just interested in doing web-based programming, you're primarily concerned with doing server-side rendering, traditional HTML type of thing, that sort of thing, right? I will argue that the best language is PHP. Just putting it out there. All things considered, I think that PHP is the best language for doing server-side rendering in general. It has been doing that well for years and years and years and years and years. It is the language of the web, still is the language of the web. I mean, it runs a third of all the world's web pages. Heck, the Sweden.se, our national web page, is done in PHP. Well, specifically it's done in WordPress, which is PHP, or rather that framework is built using PHP. So that's your answer, basically, PHP. But I want to go one further, and I want to touch on, since this question came up, I want to just offer you a little bit of guidance when it comes to PHP as well, because PHP is one of those things where it's kind of like Node. I'm going to tell you a very short story about this. A few years ago, I was interviewed for a job position, basically, and I was talking to these people. It was a very small startup, and they had just kind of started working towards their product. I spoke to them and they were talking to me about, all right, which languages I was preferring and so forth. And at the time I was selling them the idea, or rather I was promoting the idea of using Nodejs. Said and done, a few months later we speak again, and then the guy who is in charge of the company says, "Oh, Frederick, I really liked your suggestion about using Nodejs. I'm basically a Nodejs evangelist." And then I said, "Oh, awesome, cool. Can I see what you've been doing?" And he showed me their implementation in Nodejs, and they had done it all in vanilla Node. No Express server, no Happy server, no nothing, just from absolute scratch. And for some people out there, some seniors, they might say, "Oh, that's really clever." They probably did it because they had this idea that they wanted to be rid of frameworks. And I thought that as well too. And then I suggested that I just asked them, what was the motivation for not using something like Express for your server? And he said, "What's that?" So, because, for those of you who don't know that, Node.js, although you can do your own routing framework and do everything in vanilla, it is much easier. You get much more productive very quickly if you use something like Express. And this is the same type of situation for PHP. Here's what I suggest to you. If you don't know PHP as of today, go out and download XAMPP or WAMP, depending on or LAMP, if you will. And basically what this is a bootstrapping project, which will install for you in a very convenient manner Apache PHP and MySQL, which is the general, the most common stack, I argue, for PHP. When you do that, and you install that and you start running it, you will have everything you need in order to start doing PHP pages. Now, I raise my finger and I warn you, make sure that even though this is very convenient for you as a beginner, start by learning PHP through using these tools. The second thing you need to do after you understand what PHP is, and maybe you get a little bit of syntax under your belt, you understand how to load a web page, do some basic arithmetic and echoing out strings and stuff of that nature, make sure that you understand the difference between that project, and you understand in isolation what Apache actually is, because Apache is one thing, PHP is one thing, and MySQL is one thing. It's very easy, at least, and when I first did this, I was a little bit confused by this as well. It might, because these are that project, SAMP, WAMP, or whatever you want to call it, it's just a convenience to bundle those three things together, but they are separate entities. Okay, said and done. Next step, after you understand the basics of PHP, what you're most likely going to find is a bunch of tutorials that show you how to route, so do something like /index.php, /mypage.php, and do posting, getting, all that good stuff. This is what you should know. That's traditional hyperpage style of working. But today it's more common that you have something like a canonical URL where you don't include the /php part, and you do routing in a very different manner from what most of those videos are going to show you. And when I first started, I was a little bit confused by that as well. And what I can tell you then is to take the next step when you understand the absolute bare bone basics of how PHP works. And you should know that a lot of PHP websites still use this more traditional way of working, but for a more modern take on things, when you want to advance one step further, have a look at Composer first and foremost. Composer is a package management system virtually for PHP. Think of it as a way for you to manage other people's libraries coming into your project, among a few other things. So that's a very important thing if you want to take your PHP to the next level. That is something that professional programmers use quite a lot. After you've done that and you kind of know what that is, take a look at a framework. Now, I know some people don't like frameworks, but I really think that as with Nodejs, having a framework for PHP will help you a lot when you're trying to understand these more advanced topics such as routing and all of that type of stuff. Because the beauty of PHP is that it's very simple to make something very, very simple. But if you want to scale it up and make more professional level applications as a beginner, that can be a little bit tricky, especially if you haven't been introduced to these concepts before. So a framework will help you a lot. It's the same thing with Node.js. It's the same thing I tried to pitch to those guys I was telling you about, that if you don't have any experience working with the vanilla version of PHP at scale, you can mess it up very quickly, and that's where a framework can be very helpful to you. My personal suggestion to you is to learn something like Laravel. That's my personal favorite for PHP framework. It includes pretty much everything. There's a lot of nice tutorials, and it will give you everything you need in order to learn how to build really professional level applications. But once again, I raise my finger and I say, start by learning just doing basic PHP, because if you're not making something like some really large scale type of system or something very, very high level and professional, if you're just starting out something of that nature, start by doing just vanilla PHP, because it's actually that simple to do very nice web pages, server-side rendered web pages in just vanilla PHP. So those are my 2 cents. If all things considered, server-side rendering, traditional web development, without any fancy APIs or anything like that, you just want a nice blog or a home page or whatever you want to call it, PHP would be my go-to. And after you know how to set something like that up, have a look at Composer, have a look at Laravel, and kind of take it from there, and you will have everything to be a professional web developer. Have a great day.